Thanks for tuning back into the Replatform podcast sponsored by Attract and Hypersonics. You're listening to myself, James Gerd, and my wonderful co-host, Paul Rogers. Hello, mate. How are you today?
Good, thanks. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm all right. A night of sleep deprivation, and I'm looking forward to talking about projects and cost management. So let's set up this episode. But first, thank you for tuning back in for our regular listeners. And if it's your first time on the podcast, we hope you enjoy it. You can subscribe to get a new episode alert, and we'd love a like on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, Amazon Music, etc. So our topic today is practical ways to save costs in your e-commerce project without killing scope. And the reason for talking about this today is the current global and local economic outlook is pretty bleak. It's as bleak as today's winter mist in the UK. Online retail, we know, boomed during the pandemic. Online traffic and sales maintained higher than pre-pandemic levels after that through 2021. But towards the second half of last year and into this year, there's been a sharp bite of like global events, increasing costs, consumer nervousness around spending. So for some businesses, capital projects are completely canned or on hold. For others, there's a real need to continue with projects because improving tech infrastructure is critical to their growth or even protecting existing sales. But there's a sharp eye on budgets and there's a nervousness about the total spend and needing to bring those costs down. So what we're going to look at is how can you sensibly manage project costs downwards without ripping the heart out of your scope and functionality? Because one of the biggest risks in trying to strip cost is you impact capability. So we're trying to think about sensible ways of doing it and how the business can think about approaching this. So we're going to cover like biggest cost areas in a project, how you manage them, and cost efficiencies you can introduce to shave some of the cost lines. Nice to have that can be cut without materially damaging your project success. So do you reckon that gives it a good enough setup, Paul?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a lot to talk about actually.
Yeah, and really important because every project at some point, unless somebody has like endless pockets, comes down to this conversation. And typically with finance directors going, what's essential and what do we not need to spend? So let's start. So why don't you talk about the build and the agency piece and, approaches and thoughts on how you can pull out cost?
Yeah, I think this is a really important one. I think if you're looking to do a lean project, this is probably one of the areas where you could feasibly save the most money. You've obviously got agencies at different ends of the spectrum in terms of cost and, I guess how they bill and everything else. And I think, there's a lot of good agencies out there that will do a lean project. And maybe there's some areas where you can afford to compromise if you have a budget you're working to. One of the things that we've written, and I guess one other thing to add would be potentially having more, an agency do more areas to reduce cost as well. Like we've talked a lot over the last however many months about splitting out design or integrations or whatever else. If you are working to a budget, potentially again with compromise, you can work with one provider to save money. One of the big areas we've listed down here is avoiding kind of changing how a platform operates or handles certain situations unnecessarily. So we've got a few examples and I'll leave your ones for you to comment on, James. But so checkout is one where I've seen people waste, hundreds of dev hours changing the checkout unnecessarily without any like huge need. And kind of looking towards some of the studies that are available online that actually the native checkout would have been fine for launch. Another one, which is a recent example from a project I was working on, we had a client that wanted to spend literally hundreds of dev hours on changing the way that filtering worked within Shopify, allow for certain filter options to be indexable, but it was essentially a very, very specific route of implementation, which was quite unnecessary, and we could have replicated it we did go down the route of replicating it with a much leaner option. Another example, multiple addresses within a customer account. So being able to migrate, 15 customer addresses into an account. That's the kind of thing where it's like really minor friction point for a very, very small amount of customers that are going to have multiple addresses. And then you've got the data migration overhead and then all of the development overhead around customizing the platform as well. Another one in a similar vein is global accounts. So as much as I think global accounts does have a place sometimes and, it can add value for certain types of retailers, I've seen loads of people that have got multiple BigCommerce instances or Shopify instances start reviewing like single sign-on solutions, and generally just looking at scoping out major projects to allow a customer to be able to log in with the same account across multiple stores. And we'd say, again, that's like a massive edge case in most cases. And if you communicate the experience well enough, it's not necessary. And then the only other one I've listed down here a bit further on is kind of the back end processes and workflows. So again, this is more focused on, in fact, I'd say when I wrote this, it's more focused on the SaaS platform, but the same could apply to like a Magento or any other platform where you can feasibly change the way that the back end works. But yeah, you just need to be cautious. One is going to cost you more short term, but it's also going to cost you more long term. So yeah, that would be enough one.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice example. It comes down to that whole what do you really need versus what would you like that isn't critical to business success. And I found this with like order management stuff and customizations where people have been asked, like finance teams asking for things like, we want to be able to generate a commercial invoice to automatically send to customers, and we want that to come out of e-commerce. And then the question becomes, but why do you need it to come out of e-commerce? Do you not have that capability, for example, 3PLs, the ability to generate the commercial invoice, and then trying to move some of these areas out of the e-commerce project to be non-deliverables. They still need to be delivered, but actually the cost and effort in e-commerce probably doesn't make sense. Another one is BI and reporting, and we talk about this a lot, don't we? Where everyone wants to endless reporting, and that's fine, but is that the e-commerce platform's job? And an e-commerce system isn't a BI tool. Well, most are BI tools, some have BI extensions, but creating custom reports, things like promotions, you can get standardized reporting out there, but when you want to go to the extra level, like, complex reports around reporting on gift with purchase, free items, the sales and tax reporting, you have to draw a line and say, okay, the cost and effort to now generate custom reports and extract the data and manipulate it doesn't make sense. You should be doing this in other systems like ERP, or you need to invest in a BI, and that might be a phase 2. Other things I've seen where people have tried to overcomplicate is, and this is not just the e-commerce, it's in other systems, is things like product bundles, where they've wanted to create all these custom bundles for online, and they don't have the bundles set up, so they don't have like bundle SKUs in warehousing, and going down this process and conversation about, well, we want to create new bundles that we can display, and instead of trying to physically change how your products are stocked and managed, which is a pain in the arse, using things like, virtual bundles within the e-commerce system, where you just set that up as a product in e-com and it just passes through the line items in the order files to be picked as standard. And then you can set promotional pricing on the items. I think anything where you can do it simply using existing functionality versus changing any processes is sensible. And that checkout one you said, I think definitely I had a conversation once with charity where they wanted to add on top of the payment gateway native support for direct debit and the e-mandates to support recurring payments. And we went through a process of trying to understand how critical it was. And, the argument, well, our customers are used to paying by direct debit, but actually an education thing with the customers about you can set up recurring payments through the gateway, but it's card recurring payments rather than direct debit mandates. Why build in an e-mandate flow that isn't supported natively when you can use an existing functionality? Sometimes there's let's change the proposition to the customer and educate the customer rather than trying to hack a checkout, which you're right, it's massively risky to change a checkout flow. Okay, so that feels like a good set of areas that people can explore. Now I'm going to go into content management, and you let me know your thoughts on it. So I've seen this when people try to overcomplicate the content management tooling they need, because everybody wants enterprise class, best in class, publish workflow, publish schedules. But the question becomes, how much do you really need? How much is we've got to fix issues versus actually this is just like the ultimate dream if we had a bigger content team. So I think number one bit of content management is being sensible on how many different content layouts. I've seen design phases get a little bit elaborate on all these different types of layouts, rather than a good example would be like if you have an image with text and a heading, thinking about how that could work in different ways to satisfy different content needs across the site, and building a functional spec around it that enables that flexibility rather than having to create different layouts which involve additional code. So you could create a standardized layout that can be flipped. So, with a simple bit of logic to change, the image now goes on the right, the text on the left. You can add or remove the heading. You can add a call to action button. You can add or remove a link. So you can create you can basically create multiple functions for the same layout and do that in one piece of development rather than having 4 or 5 different layouts for the same thing. So I think there's an intelligence around thinking about how you execute content management, layouts, flexibility. And then it's the other functionality around it, like people wanting a staged environment. Do you need that? Because a lot of systems nowadays don't provide standard staging without having either third-party plugins or having to set up additional environments, and there's a cost and effort and maintenance. You can avoid that. I mean, live previews work for a lot of businesses that don't have complex content needs. So I think there are times when you can just push back and go, do you really need that? Versus look at how the tooling would enable you to achieve that in a different way. What's your take on the content management?
Yeah, I think I agree with what you are saying. And I think the other thing is all of the platforms are getting so much better in this area. Like Shopify have just announced loads of stuff around how they're starting to introduce their own kind of content models and everything else. And then they're introducing like meta objects. And I think, all of the other platforms are doing the same. And your last point here around third party, I think is a really good point. Like all the time I see people just spend a fortune on third parties, particularly if they go down the headless route, and it's really unnecessary. Like, there was one I heard about recently where they basically invested probably 60% of their budget into a DXP, and it was really unnecessary and it didn't add too much value. So I think this is a really good area where you can just work within the parameters of the platform, and you just need to avoid the shiny things for sure.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point. Is it comes back to prioritization, which we'll come on to in a minute, because you've got to have very robust processes for defining priorities. But I've seen this before as well. People want the ultimate end goal of a DXP and personalized content management. But when you strip it back and go, well, how much do you really need to do that? And do you have the internal resource to truly personalize content? Because it's not just the system doesn't do it. It's got to have the content in it to drive it. And there's a limit to what AI can do. There is a human element to generating the content assets and managing the distribution across different systems. So I think I think there's an element of positively challenging businesses and how capable are they ready to use this toolkit versus is 80% of it going to be sat there idle for the first 12 months, in which case defer that to a later phase.
Attract, your complete product discovery growth engine. Create relevant shopping experiences that convert into sales and grow online revenue with personalized search, merchandising and recommendation solutions powered by AI. Find out more at attract.com.
I was just going to add to that. There's going to be 2 underlying themes here, or like the 2 big challenges for anyone as a person managing a project going into this is one, as you say, prioritization. And the biggest one's going to be stakeholder management, because most of the things that I'm talking about here are not controlled by the person running the project. It's like other stakeholders that have different priorities. So I think like that's the bit where you kind of need to get your ducks in a row early on and set expectations and everything else, which we've obviously talked about loads over the last 2.5 years. But I think that's kind of like the main underlying.
Yeah, exactly. And that leads us on to like scope control, which is a suitably generic title for what we're going to talk about. So I'll start with the discipline bit, and then you can talk at some of the practical ways that you can do this. So for me, it starts with a proper prioritization criteria, and just saying we're using Moscow is not enough. It's far too subjective. Like if you ask a subject matter expert if all of the requirements they've defined are must-haves, they're going to say yes. You have to pull apart what must is, and it's things like, do we already have it and it is needed? Either it's business critical for us or the customers need it to trade with us. Is it fixing a known issue where we've got to do that, otherwise we continue with a problem? Is it protecting or growing revenue? Is it essential for compliance? So if we don't do this, we're going to get our hands slapped to risk of fine. There have to be proper criteria around must versus should, could, and won't. So I think that's a discipline a lot of projects don't go through early on. They just say, right, give us a Moscow, and everything comes back with an M or S. And then you have to spend another load of time going through and pulling that apart. So that's my starting point, is get everyone bought into that and communicate and explain to people why this series of criteria is, because it will make it a lot easier to defer things into other phases if you've got this nailed down. And that's where project steering comes in handy. And I know a lot of people go, oh, that's for big projects. It's not. Project steering just means having a process and governance that helps you make the right decisions. In a small business, it can literally be the project owner and sponsor. The sponsor might be the CFO, the project owner might be the head of ecom. Project steering doesn't have to have 8 people on a committee that meets every week or month. It can be 2 people, being very agile, but having a set of decision criteria so that they can make decisions and then communicate it back out. So that's my dullness in terms of things that help you to have the right structure in place to manage price cost downwards. What are some of your examples of where you see the ability to take items out of scope?
Yeah, so I think, as you say, it's important to come back to what should be pushed out of scope. I've seen recently things like href-lang and certain levels of being able to manage redirects be pushed out of scope. And SEO is one where there's not always a champion kind of fight in the corner for it. So that's one that I think can wrongfully be pushed out of scope to do that properly. And like you say, compliance and everything else. I think one that I've written down as integrations. I think that's something where people get carried away quite often because, I guess you're going to have an ops team and they will have a dream of, or not even necessarily just the ops team, but you'll have different stakeholders in the business that will have dreams of housing everything in the ERP and just pushing out any kind of, web stores you have and everything else. And maybe, they will have been sold a dream through a sales process of using an ERP like a PIM or, certain bits of order management. And I think I often see that be a big variable for budget and timeline in replatforming, where I guess if you can, and particularly if you're working to a tight timescale or budget, you probably want to be looking at what you have right now, taking that across. If there's any obvious things that can add a lot of value to the business with minimal dev hours or professional services hours, I think that makes perfect sense. But this is again like an area where you can just lose a shed load of money, and actually it could be done further in the future or it could be avoided entirely. So I think that's a big one for me. Design would be another one. I think you go through a design process, again you've got some more challenging stakeholders and they start throwing all sorts in that they've seen on Burberry or Loewe or whoever else. So I think that's another one where you need to be very mindful of scope when you go through a design process. And I think they're probably the 2 big ones that I would add to what you said.
Yeah, I feel like we need to do a separate episode on managing design phases and them exploding out of control, because I find these are the ones that are, especially in with a lot of luxury brands, controlling stakeholders and it becomes challenging. I think my last point of scope control is embedding a principle amongst every stakeholders. We are going to make the most of our platform ecosystem, and we will only go outside that where there is a clear business case. A good example, I had a project recently where the clients, an omnichannel, they've got a store, and there is a clear journey for product discovery from online into store, where a lot of conversions get completed in store, and therefore POS is really important. And they were looking at a full service like clienteling solution for in-store, but not just being able to take a transaction, but then doing customer comms and customer loyalty. And actually sensibly decided that because they were using Shopify Plus, that integrating with Shopify POS was the path of least resistance and least cost, because Shopify with Plus, POS is included for things up to 8 instances. So you've got no license fee. The data model's aligned from the customer point of view, so you can pick up customer basket in store. It's unified on the single customer account. It actually gives it a lot of efficiencies. And they decided they could push the clienteling stuff out into a separate phase or into a separate solution afterwards. And that simplified it and kept the costs down. So I think sometimes there's just that ability to pull back the expectation, say, okay, what is essential for start, and we can save quite a bit of development cost if we keep to that ecosystem where there's already integration paths. Next bit is project management, and this is an area where actually even on small projects you can cut cost or minimize cost depending on how you approach it. So I think for a lot of projects that the instant thought is we need a project manager, we need somebody to control it in-house. And that project manager is going to be a contractor normally, because you're not going to employ a project manager unless you're a massive business where you've got ongoing projects where you can justify the headcount. A full-time contract PM, if you take like UK, you're talking £500 a day plus, depending on level of experience and seniority. So that over 6 months, that's an expensive cost. Now, it can be highly justified because project management's critical to success. But if you don't have a complex project, say you're a small team, it's a single site, limited integrations, and there aren't many stakeholders to manage, there aren't lots of other projects that have dependencies to plan and coordinate. The question is, do you really need a full-time PM your side? You let the systems integrator do all the technical PM work because that's what their PM will do. You could, if you make sure that one person for your current team is the day-to-day contact and has a bandwidth to work with their technical PM and manage tasks and coordinate internally to get stuff done, arguably you can do that. And that can cut out a large sum from the project. The in-between versions you can use, and I've done this before, and it's not about pitching my service, it's just saying this is a way that you can reduce it, is have an experienced consultant to support and give oversight and help the team to keep things in control and make sure the agency's focused on the right areas. And you can do that for like 1 day a week in a retainer. You can save 40k plus on a 6-month project by not having a permanent PM. So there are ways to do it. There are pros and cons to this. I mean, I'm all for project managers. I think project managers are worth their weight in gold. But when you have budget constraints, you've got to think about where's the best use of that spent. And if you get the right agency partner who's got a really good experienced PM who you trust and work with and got a good relationship, you can sometimes pull this bit back. So the next point, which I know you're going to talk more about, Paul, is ensuring you have enough definition to avoid overages. And I guess this is thinking about like support contracts as well. So do you want to talk people through that?
Yeah, so I think biggest risk to budget is having like a super open brief post discovery and not having enough definition to cover yourself and having like, assumptions and misunderstanding around how things are going to be approached. So I think, one thing is getting enough definition up front to even get a reasonable quote or like a semi-accurate quote pre-discovery. You then go into discovery, you then have the discussion around what's needed, everything else, and then you end up with a quote you're happy with. But I would say at that point, you need to be avoiding T&M as much as possible, and you need to leave as little open as possible, and you need to make sure that you've got a very detailed spec as to how things are working on the front end, on the back end. Ideally, you'd have like user stories and user acceptance criteria, summary acceptance criteria and everything else. I think that then covers you because, you often see projects that go well over budget and it's always caused by T&M. And to be honest, the holy grail here is you end up somewhere in the middle so that it's kind of fair on both sides. And then, you set parameters so that things are reasonable or the potential overages are reasonable. And, it works for both the client and the agency. But I would say if you're working to a budget, you have to be very careful with that. One other thing that I've already touched on that I've mentioned here is using a single agency for design and dev, but you just need to make sure that you're diligent in finding a partner that is good at development with that platform and good at design, essentially, and can, cater for the needs of the business. And then the other one that, again, I've already touched on is potentially finding a partner that could help with integrations as well, assuming that their offering is sufficient, I guess, because that's not always the case. But yeah, I think they're good areas to avoid unnecessary expense.
Yeah, I think you're right. And we've talked about this on lots of different episodes of the criticality of a discovery phase in helping manage costs. And I would always urge people that when people, especially finance teams, look at discovery as a cost rather than a value add, they see a cost line like, $6,000, $8,000, $10,000, depending on the size of the project. And then there's a reticence to how can we reduce this? Can we narrow this? Can we do fewer workshops? And it's a false economy because you're right, you save more money by better decision making during discovery than otherwise you end up with a statement of work that just keeps creeping and creeping during a project. So I'd 100% agree, put the right money into discovery and you can save costs later on. And I think that thing you said about looking at the right partners is important because depending on your setup, you end up with different SLAs, support level agreements. So if you pick a partner who focuses only on the design in the front end but doesn't do any of the integration work, you've got to make sure that that partner can provide an end-to-end SLA for all the technical support management, so that you're not paying multiple fees, one to them and one to an integration partner. If you are, how have you negotiated them, and do you understand how that relationship works, so you don't end up in a position where later on there's a problem? You end up incurring time from the front-end partner and time from the integration partner to fix an issue, which ends up with a duplication of costs. A single SLA will always be more cost-effective, but it doesn't mean that it's permissible within the setup you've got with your partners. So yeah, I agree. You've got to really nail down into that and negotiate effectively. Now let's talk about a really important one: third-party solutions. Especially with the modern obsession about talking about flexible commerce, headless commerce, composable commerce, pick your buzzword at will. But there is definitely a business driver towards using best in breed. Not everyone wants an all-in-one solution. The ability to plug and play capabilities into the core platform to extend your customer experience or your business tooling. So what advice have you got about how do you sensibly manage the cost of third parties so you don't add stuff in you don't need?
Yeah, I think a big part of it is understanding the native capabilities of the platform, for one, and looking at that versus what you have at the moment versus what you actually need. I guess product recommendations would be a really good example for me, where quite often it won't add too much time to manage recs based on rules or even manually, versus paying a fortune for a personalization tool. And that's not to say certain brands won't end up with rationale to go down that route, particularly if you're a big complex catalog, multi-brand, etc. Makes complete sense. But that's often one example. Search could be another, content management another. I think it's just looking at what your requirements are versus what you can do with the platform. Because the other thing is sometimes you'll just benefit from using the platform in terms of you talked about connectivity of ecosystem earlier a little bit, or you touched on it. And I think sometimes if you use a native feature within the platform, actually, you'll benefit from having, being able to use standard APIs, being able to, integrate straight into your ESP or whatever other third parties you're using. So not even always just about cost, but I always feel like it's a case of trying to stick to native until you build a case otherwise. And in a lot of cases, you'd be able to save a lot of money in this area by trialing platform functionality first, assuming it's a budget constraint.
Yeah, I like that. I like that approach. I think that's a really good philosophy for people to have, is we don't pull in any third parties unless we fundamentally can't achieve our business vision without it, and that we understand the business case for it. And the business case doesn't just have to be about revenue. It could be about retaining customers. I guess, which is revenue basically, but as in it isn't a revenue growth, it's a protection of what you've already got. Or it could be an internal cost efficiency. I think a couple of examples I've seen of that native versus third party, a project where people wanted to put Algolia in for AI, ML, search, best in class search. And I like Algolia. I think it's a great platform. It's got really good search engine and is better than a lot of native capabilities. But actually, when we looked at it, the search sessions were around 2% of all sessions, and the queries were so basic. I mean, there was hardly any queries above 2 words. So the native Elastic, with the right setup, would cater for all of the core queries they needed. They didn't actually need to invest in the tool, and the demand wasn't there. So all of a sudden you say, well, actually, you're not ready for that yet. As the site sophistication goes up and as the search query complexity goes up, then you've got the next phase investment in that to take it to the next level. And then personalization, I think you talked about earlier about DXPs, etc. Is, do you currently have personalization? If the answer is no, you don't have to have it for phase 1. You can push it to phase 2. But secondly, it's about understanding buying cycles and frequency of visit. If people on average visit once every few months, and you don't have loads and loads of frequent visits to build up a decent, strong profile of the customer, and the purchase frequency is not that often. So what merit is there in an AI and ML engine overlaying advanced personalization? And do you need the segmentation capability? Do you have strong enough customer segments? Is there enough distinction between how people shop? And if you're like a mono brand with a very small product catalog, there are diminishing returns for having this level of personalization. You might want to think about how you actually just use things like visual merchandising to control the visual presentation to the customer rather than automation strategies. So there's always arguments for and against these things, but you've got to have them and push back. And sometimes you can strip tens of thousands out of a project on an ongoing licensing point of view just by having that conversation. Cool. So the next, or the final area we're going to pull out today is subject matter specialists. So this is where you use third-party consultants, agencies, contractors to deliver capability. So what's your take on this?
Yeah, so I think we've got a few listed here. I think the first one listed is SEO. I personally think that's absolutely critical, but I think in a lot of cases, in fact, most cases, I prefer it anyway. I think you could go down the route of using a contractor versus a large agency, and you look at outlaying 20K versus 100K as an example. So I think that's one potential cost saving, but I do think having a tech SEO input for a project is absolutely critical, and having someone that's taken full ownership of the deliverables. Analytics, I've put in the same bracket, same principle. Like, there are some really good specialists out there, rather than needing to use a large agency. But I think it's really important that you get that done right. And, a big part of replatforming is measurement and being able to, look at numbers and see if it's been a bad project, good project, successful, failure. And in order to do that, you have to have a like for like, or at least an understanding of why it's different. So I think analytics is really important. And then QA and UAT is the other one that I've put down. Do you need a third party here? Like, quite often we'll pull in someone to support with UAT if there's not enough resources or capacity across the project team. But is it necessary? Like, could you do it in-house? Could you pull in different members of the business and give them particularly detailed test scripts? Can you do it yourself? And I guess that's the overall principle, isn't it? But yeah, I think you've got a few more written down here as well.
Yeah, I think that whole thing about agency versus freelancer is really important, because there are a lot of incredibly good agencies out there that are very good at adapting their core process to suit different businesses. There are others that are very good in a specific niche and have a standardized approach. It doesn't suit all companies, and therefore you could end up paying for a level of service you don't need that isn't as ideally suited to your business. And freelancers, but generally, not always, will be lower cost because they don't have the big agency overheads to manage. So you can sometimes strip, 3, 4, 5K out of a project by using like a technical SEO freelancer versus using an agency and a retainer. Fully agree with that. And the UAT, about 100% with you, unless the size and complexity of the project and the number of stakeholders of the business means that if you don't have a specialist who's writing the scripts and controlling it, it's going to get messy. On so many projects, I've done UAT scripts in Google Sheets for people working with their stakeholders, where we just have it, and it's built. If you get the right statement of work, you can very quickly generate UAT scripts because you've got all of the list of capabilities that you want to be able to validate. So yeah, I'm 100% agree. I think the other one I'll pull out, accessibility. Now, accessibility is hugely important, not just because compliance-wise you risk fines if you get it wrong, but why would you want to piss off millions and millions of people who want to be able to use your site effectively, whether they're using screen readers or they've got visual impairment? It doesn't make any sense. So from a CX point of view, you've got to have the basics of accessibility covered, but there are ways to do it. So partner with the right technical agency, they will build to accessible coding standards, get the right platform, accessibility in terms of how that platform's built and the core code in there, like, themes and templates is there. Then you have, there are online tools that can give you basic accessibility audits and checks for free that will give you pointers if there's anything, that's not meeting the basic level of compliance for, WCAG, for ADA in the US. And again, here, you don't have to have an excellent expert unless the risk of not doing this correctly means that actually it's more of a business damage than not investing it. And then accessibility audit experts are worth their weight in gold. So I think sometimes you've got to ask that question, how critical is doing the additional level of auditing versus what you'll get through choosing the right platform and partners. So we've gone through quite a lot. Any like parting words of wisdom about about what people need to think about when approaching cost reductions in projects?
I don't think so. I think the only thing I would say, because like Ruth said, comes down to prioritization and stakeholder management. I think the only thing I'd say is if you're prioritizing things and you don't necessarily fully understand an area, just ask other people, be that the agencies you're talking to, consultants, whatever else. You made a point around sometimes just paying for like hours of consultancy can save you a lot of money. And I think just ask people that have done it before, because I think I've seen some projects that have been like super lean, be like ridiculously successful. But I think as long as you're like informed, you don't go compromise in the wrong areas. I think, there's nothing wrong with going down this route.
Yeah, agreed. And it's interesting. I posted out on LinkedIn earlier about to lots of people. Okay, we're planning on doing an episode like this. What have you learned, and what would your tips be? Because what I want to do is include them when we put the post live, include like what other people have said in the industry. And actually, a lot of the initial stuff coming back is about scope management, MVP, being sensible about what you have to have for launch versus what you don't need, so you're not spending on things that aren't critical to the business. So there's a lot of commonality on this phasing as well. So it's interesting to see that other people are thinking along the same lines. But if you're listening, go to the website. We have a landing page on all of our posts. I'll be adding in other people's comments and referencing who gave them, so you can always connect with other people if you want to pick their brains as well. Cool. So I hope that's been useful and practical. Thanks for listening. Do keep your ear open for next episode. We'll drop one every week. We'd love you to subscribe if you haven't already, and we would love if you haven't given us one a rating on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, etc. Make us feel better about ourselves. Until next week, everybody. For more information on this topic, head over to replatform.fm for our audio podcasts. To discuss a project, or if you'd like to chat about any of the topics covered in this episode in more detail, please reach out to myself, James Gurd, or my co-host Paul Rogers via LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks again for listening, and keep your ears peeled for the next episode.